All right, let's dive into some of the finer points today.
Yeah.
Really get granular. Those tiny details that can really make a big difference when it comes to your investments. Today, we're looking at market trends.
Oh, yeah.
Those global happenings that can really shake things up. And specifically, we're zeroing in on the U.S. and Taiwanese markets.
Yeah, sometimes it's those seemingly small data points, that kind of fly under the radar. Those can give us the best clues about where things are actually going.
Exactly. And we've got this really fascinating analysis we're going to break down,
Oh.
particularly all about U.S. elections and inflation and what it all means for those Taiwanese tech giants that you might be keeping an eye on. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's kick things off with a good old-fashioned look at the U.S. economy as it stands. We just got October's inflation data, and the CPI is showing a little uptick, 2.6% overall and 3.3% for core inflation. I know what you're thinking. Inflation. Isn't that a bad thing?
Right. Well, not necessarily. Not always. It's all about context. Here, what's interesting is that this little bump actually suggests that inflation is stabilizing, what the economists lately call normalizing.
hmm
And for investors, this is actually good news because it means we can maybe calm down a bit about those runaway price increases that we were seeing before.
Okay, so normalizing inflation, not the scary kind. Gotcha.
Mm.
But what does this all mean for things like interest rates? We know the Fed has been kind of, playing this rate hike game recently.
Yeah, for sure. And this stable inflation environment, it actually makes a December rate cut more likely, at least if you go by the CME FedWatch tool, which, it's a pretty good indicator of what the market's thinking. Basically, what this means is that borrowing costs could go down for
Right.
businesses and just, for us regular folks, which could give the economy a little bit of a nudge in the right direction.
So good news, potentially, especially for borrowers. Now, let's shift gears a bit and zoom in on the stock market. The Dow seems to be taking a breather after a bit of a roller coaster,
Yeah.
ups and downs. But the Nasdaq is telling a bit of a different story. 3 days of decline, which maybe hints at a consolidation phase, especially for tech stocks. And here's where things get really interesting if you're watching Taiwan. The Philadelphia Semiconductor Index, which is pretty closely tied to Taiwan's economy, it's been on this 4-day losing streak. Not exactly a vote of confidence for the tech sector, is it?
It definitely raises some questions, no doubt. You got to pay attention to that. Semiconductors, I mean, it's a global powerhouse. Any sign of weakness there, it can send shockwaves, ripples throughout the entire tech world,
Right.
especially for a big player like Taiwan.
And speaking of signals, what's the bond market telling us these days? The 10-year U.S. Treasury yield is sitting high, 4.45%. It's got to mean something, right?
It does. Yeah, a yield like that, usually that means there's a strong demand for those safer assets, which often happens when, investors are getting a little bit nervous about the economy, you know what I mean? Feeling a bit shaky. But the thing is, the yield's still pretty high, which might suggest that all this talk about a recession, maybe it's a bit overblown.
Okay, so a cautious bond market, but not hitting the panic button just yet. Got it. Now, the dollar, it seems like it's, showing off a bit lately,
Yeah.
flexing its muscles. The dollar index is up past 106, meaning capital's flowing back to the U.S. What's behind that?
Well, one thing we can't ignore, of course, is the U.S. election coming up. The fact that everybody seems to think Trump's going to win, it seems to be fueling the surge in the dollar. Investors are, I guess you could say, optimistic about the impact his policies might have on the economy.
So we've got a pretty good picture of what's going on stateside. But now let's hop across the Pacific over to Taiwan and see how all these U.S. trends are playing out over there. What's the general feeling in the Taiwanese market?
Well, if you look at the Taiwan stock index, it's definitely feeling the effects of what's happening in the U.S., especially that correction we talked about in semiconductor stocks. Those two markets are pretty closely linked. Any little wobble on one side, you're going to feel it on the other.
Makes sense. But it's not just the overall market that's feeling the squeeze,
No.
right? We're all about the details here. So what else are you seeing?
You're right. Let's zero in a bit. We're seeing some of the big players, the institutions like JP Morgan, Merrill Lynch, they're starting to reduce their positions in Taiwanese stocks. And when those big guys make a move like that, it definitely adds to that downward pressure. It's a sign that they're being careful, taking a wait and see approach. And these are the folks who usually have a pretty good sense of what's coming.
So the big institutions are pumping the brakes a little. What about foreign investors? Are they feeling the same way?
It seems like it. One thing that really stands out is the high level of foreign short positions in the Taiwanese market. What that tells us is that a lot of foreign investors, they're betting on prices dropping even further. And of course, that has implications for things like upcoming futures and options expirations, which can just add even more volatility to the whole situation. It's something to keep an eye on for sure.
And it all comes back to that uncertainty around the U.S. election. What a Trump win could mean for Taiwan. Nobody really knows.
Right, those ripple effects, who knows how things will shake out. So let's say, hypothetically, Trump wins. What could happen to those capital flows in Taiwan?
Well, we could see even more movement, more investors pulling their money out of Taiwan back to the U.S., more pressure on the Taiwanese market.
Yeah.
It's that classic fight to safety. When things get uncertain, everybody heads for what they think is the safest bet.
And we're already seeing hints of that, right? The Taiwan dollar's been losing value lately, which usually means capital's flowing out. Exactly, yeah. And that weaker currency, well, it throws a wrench in things for those Taiwanese companies that rely on exports. I mean, on the one hand, it makes their products cheaper for other countries to buy. So that could boost sales, right?
Sure.
But then again, it also makes imports more expensive, which could mess with their production costs.
So it's a tough spot for those exporters. They got to find that sweet spot, that balance. But let's get even more specific, granular. What does all this mean for certain sectors in Taiwan? Especially for those of us who might actually have investments in these companies, right?
Right. Let's break it down. So if you're holding tech stocks, names like TSMC, Han Hai, MediaTek, you've probably noticed a bit of a dip lately. That's because of those sell-offs we talked about, those targeted moves.
Yeah, those are some big players in tech for sure.
Mhm.
What about the financial sector? Anything interesting popping up there?
That one you want to keep a close eye on. The financial index has dropped below some key support levels. And one thing that's kind of flashing a warning sign is that break of the 20-week moving average. Let me explain that a little.
Yeah, break that down for us.
Basically, a moving average, it's like a line that kind of smooths out the price changes over a certain period. In this case, 20 weeks. So when the price drops below that line, it's usually a sign that, well, things could keep going down.
Not exactly a pretty picture for finance then. But with all this uncertainty, the market being a bit jittery, are there any bright spots? Any sectors where things are looking up?
Oh, absolutely. It's important to remember when markets get volatile, that can be a good thing. It creates opportunities for those who are patient, strategic. One area that's showing some interesting movement is the over-the-counter market, mostly because of those foreign sell-offs we talked about.
The over-the-counter market, that's where you find those smaller companies, the ones that aren't as well known, right?
Exactly, yeah. And because they kind of fly under the radar, they don't get as much attention from the big investors. Their stock prices tend to be more sensitive to those short-term ups and downs. But for long-term investors, that can be a gold mine. You can find some real bargains there, some hidden gems, It's all about looking past the headlines, digging a little deeper.
So what specific sectors within that over-the-counter market should we be watching? Where are those hidden gems hiding?
Two areas to keep an eye on are healthcare and green energy. They tend to get overshadowed when the tech sector's hot, but those two, they've got some serious long-term growth potential, especially in a market like Taiwan, which is all about sustainability and innovation.
It's a good reminder that no matter what the market's doing, diversifying is always a smart move. But let's zoom out for a sec. Let's talk about those bigger global shifts that are affecting both the U.S. and Taiwan. One big one is how those global supply chains are being restructured. Even Taiwan's central bank has issued a warning about what this could mean for their economy.
Yeah, that's right. Global supply chains are in a state of flux right now, and it's causing a lot of uncertainty. Businesses, economies, everybody's kind of on edge. The central bank's concern is that these changes could lead to higher production costs and more inflation, both for Taiwan and the rest of the world.
So this is something that could affect all of us, not just investors in Taiwan.
Absolutely. It's a global trend. It's impacting every sector. It's kind of like that Jenga game, You pull out the wrong block and the whole tower could come crashing down.
Now, we've talked a lot about how a Trump victory could be bad news for Taiwan. But are there any potential upsides? Any silver linings?
Well, there's a chance that some of Trump's policies could actually benefit Taiwan, especially his stance on China's trade practices. As Trump keeps hitting China with those tariffs and trade restrictions, some companies might start looking for other places to manufacture their goods. And Taiwan, with its advanced manufacturing and skilled workers, it could be a pretty attractive option.
So Taiwan could become like a safe haven for businesses that want to move away from China.
Exactly. But here's the catch. It's not all sunshine and roses. If those trade tensions between the U.S. and China get even worse, that could hurt Taiwan too. After all, China's a huge trading partner for Taiwan. Any disruption in that relationship, and there could be serious consequences.
It's that balancing act again, that delicate dance. So with all these factors swirling around, what's the best way for investors to handle this volatile market, especially in Taiwan?
Well, in the short term, the name of the game is caution. Don't chase those high prices, especially in tech and semiconductors. Those sectors are all over the place right now. Don't get swept up in the hype. Don't try to time the market. Think long term. Taiwan has strong economic fundamentals, and those quality stocks, especially in tech and those export-driven sectors, they're still solid bets for the long haul.
So stay calm. Don't let those short-term swings derail your long-term plan.
Exactly. And remember, when the market dips, that's often the best time to buy. If you're patient, you know.
All right, we've covered a lot of ground today, but are there any sectors or industries that you're particularly bullish on for the long term, especially in Taiwan? What are you seeing?
I'm still really optimistic about the semiconductor and electronics industries in Taiwan. They're in a prime position to benefit from those global supply chain shifts we talked about. Plus, the demand for advanced components, it's only going up. Think 5G, artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, all that. Taiwan's right at the heart of all that, those tech advancements that are shaping the future. And for investors who are in it for the long haul, that's a pretty exciting prospect.
So even with all this back and forth, all this uncertainty, there's still a lot to be optimistic about in Taiwan, especially if you're thinking long term, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. But, investing, it's not just about picking the right sector or even the right stocks. It's about understanding the bigger picture, how everything connects, those forces that shape the market.
Right, it's all about seeing the patterns, connecting those dots. And today, well, we've done a deep dive into those details, those finer points in the U.S. and Taiwanese markets. Looking at those connections between inflation and elections and supply chains, even how those currencies are fluctuating.
Yeah, we've really highlighted how those seemingly small details, they can have a big impact on your decisions as an investor.
Exactly. But this deep dive, it's really just the starting point,
Yeah.
you know? Now it's your turn to take this knowledge, this information, and apply it to your own situation, your own portfolio.
Think of it as like a jumping off point.
Okay.
What parts of the Taiwanese market are you most interested in? What industries, what companies really fit with your investment goals? This is your chance to dig a little deeper, maybe even revisit some of the stuff we've talked about today.
Because at the end of the day, being a good investor, it's not just about reading the headlines, you know? It's about understanding those nuances, thinking for yourself, making those smart decisions that align with your long-term goals.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay invested, right?
Well, that about wraps up another deep dive. Thanks for joining us as we explored all those crucial details, the stuff that can make all the difference when it comes to investing.
Always a pleasure to share these insights with you. And hey, remember, happy investing.